principle of abstraction. A. The breach version. The main objection to the constitutive strategy, as we noticed many pages ago, is its apparent circularity. It seems to begin the argument too close to the end. It defines an egalitarian distribution so that liberty is already present in the very definition of equality, and then declares that, for that reason, equality and liberty cannot conflict. How can we construct a constitutive argument for equality of resources that does not claim victory but fights in this unhelpful way? How can we build a genuine argument for liberty if we begin in a definition that already secures it? We do not begin in a definition because equality of resources is not the foundation of our argument. We begin further back in the more abstract egalitarian principle, which requires a community to treat each of its members with equal concern. We accept that principle, and, at least for purposes of this chapter, we accept equality of resources as the best interpretation or conception of it. So we can use what I shall call the breach version of the constitutive strategy. We hold two ideas in place: the abstract egalitarian principle, which demands equal concern, on the one hand, and equality of resources, which proposes that an auction under certain conditions realizes equal concern, on the other. We select the baseline system from among those we consider that builds the best bridge between those two ideas. We select the baseline system that gives most plausibility to the claim that an auction from that baseline treats people with equal concern. This bridge strategy, I shall argue, endorses one powerful and general principle, the principle of abstraction, as a central part of any appropriate baseline. This principle establishes a strong presumption in favor of freedom of choice. It insists that an ideal distribution is possible only when people are legally free to act as they wish, except so far as constraints on their freedom are necessary to protect security of person and property, or to correct certain imperfections in markets, or other auction-like distributive mechanisms that I shall describe in due course. The principle of abstraction does not endorse liberty as license, but it is sufficiently powerful to form the heart of an adequate conception of liberty. Moreover, the breach strategy also supports, as I shall try to show, more specific rights to liberty that protect people from constraints on their freedom, even when the principle of abstraction would yield to other considerations. These more specific rights are sufficient to complete an adequate conception of liberty. If so, the constitutive strategy for reconciling liberty and equality is successful, but that happy result is the upshot of an argument, not a hollow definitional victory won in advance. The breach strategy does not, however, yield an exhaustive account of the rights to liberty and equality that equality of resources would require. An exhaustive list would draw on other aspects of equality of resources beyond its theory of distributional equality, including, particularly, its interpretation of political equality or democracy. See Chapter 4. I am anxious not to be misunderstood on this point. The arguments I provide here for the principle of abstraction and certain other rights emphasize the importance of liberty for distributional equality. I should not be understood as claiming that arguments of that sort are the only arguments we have or need for all the rights to liberty we should want to recognize. Nevertheless, the arguments I shall set out for the principle of abstraction and certain other rights are sufficient in themselves to establish a prominent place for liberty and equality of resources. In the final sections of the chapter, we shall consider how those arguments bear on decisions about liberty in the real world of practical politics, including the decisions described in the examples I began by listing. I make one assumption in my argument for and about the principle of abstraction that I shall not develop. I assume that any competent baseline liberty constraint system would include a principle of security. This would mandate constraints on liberty necessary to provide people with enough physical security and even enough control over their own property to allow them to make and carry out plans and projects. I assume, in short, that an adequate baseline system would have legal constraints forbidding physical assault, theft, deliberate damage to property, and trespass of the sort that are common to the criminal and civil laws of all developed legal systems. I do not mean to suggest that all communities have exactly the same rules, or that there is a single, natural meaning of ownership from which such rules can be drawn. Interesting questions arise about the details of such constraints in an ideal egalitarian distribution, but I shall neglect most of these as removed from our present focus on the problem of liberty, and simply assume that familiar and general constraints of this sort are provided in the baseline. 2 minutes, enfin 2 secondes plutôt, 2 seconds. Ah. Bon. Là, je suis vraiment dans la galère, ça n'avance pas. Non, les carreaux, tu peux faire les carreaux là, tu vois, là dans le cabinet de toilette, tu vas voir dans le cabinet de toilette, pour laver les carreaux, télescopiques, c'est difficile de voir en hauteur. Il faut, il faut mettre des fois, passer le là et puis de faire en livre, c'est ça, moi je sais pas, tu vois, voilà, là je suis pas dans la galère. Enfin, parce que je ne peux pas sur l'autoroute. Bien. Donc, B. True opportunity costs. I shall now describe in a preliminary way the key argument the Brit strategy provides for the principle of abstraction. Every conception of equality supplies, through its description of an ideal distribution, a metric of equality, a theory about how resources should be measured in deciding when people have equal shares. Equality of resources uses the special metric of opportunity costs. It fixes the value of any transferable resource one person has the value others forego by his having it. It deems such resources to be equally divided when the total transferable resources of each person have the same aggregate opportunity costs measured in that way. The imaginary auction is designed to secure exactly that result. If the auction ends, then aggregate opportunity costs, as defined by that auction, are equal. But different auctions will identify opportunity costs differently. That is only to repeat, in different language, that what we have now several times noticed. Auctions from different baselines will produce different results, each of which satisfies the envy test. But the force of that observation is special in this context. It shows that the breach strategy must find some way of identifying what we might call the true opportunity costs of a set of resources. If we can give sense to the idea of true opportunity costs, then we can select baseline provisions about liberty as providing the best bridge between the abstract egalitarian principle and the envy test by asking which such provisions are best calculated to identify and reflect true opportunity costs. But if we cannot make sense of the idea, then we cannot say that an auction from one baseline, which yields one set of prices and results, comes any closer to the ideals of equality of resources than another from a very different baseline that yields very different prices and results. Equality of resources would then be an empty, because hopelessly indeterminate, conception of equality. So our project of building a bridge between the abstract egalitarian principle and the envy test with its auction device requires an adequate theory of true opportunity costs. We need such a theory, for example, to attack the baseline issue I mentioned earlier, fixing the form in which goods are auctioned. Suppose some parties to the auction went together to buy enough land for a football stadium. The price they must pay will depend, among other things, on the size of the lots that are auctioned. If the auctioneer sells land in lot sizes no smaller than exactly the size needed for a stadium, and the baseline prohibits transactions subdividing these lots after the auction is completed, the stadium builders will almost certainly pay less than if the auctioneer offered lots in as small a size as anyone else wanted. The second of these auctions, in which land is offered in smaller lots, seems fairer than the first. It seems better to realize the goals of equality of resources. But why? It is no answer with inequality of resources to say that welfare will be higher on average or more nearly equal under the second auction than under the first. Indeed, under some circumstances, these claims would be false. We might be tempted to say that since the stadium builders would have to pay more in the second auction, the first auction, which allows lands to be sold only in large lots, hides costs the second auction reveals, and that the true opportunity costs of the land are therefore understated in the first auction. But the fact that the cost of the land is higher in the second auction cannot itself be the reason why the second is fairer. Why should we not say that in the second auction the cost of the land is overstated? And because the cost of the stadium land would be less in the first auction, the cost of other resources would be higher. Why should we not then say that, with respect to those other resources, the first auction is fairer than the second? We must find a better explanation for our sense that the second auction is fairer than the first. We must look for some principle that both justifies that intuition and provides an adequate bridge between the abstract egalitarian principle and the envy test. Equality of resources aims that each person have an equal share of resources measured by the cost of the choices he makes, reflecting his own plans and preferences to the plans and projects of others. That is its understanding of an equal distribution of resources, its interpretation of how a community scheme of private property treats all members with equal concern. If we accept that understanding, it follows that an auction is fairer, that it provides a more genuinely equal distribution, when it offers more discriminating choices and is thus more sensitive to the discrete plans and preferences people in fact have. In the first of the two auctions we just imagined, someone must pay the same price for land whether his tastes and ambitions are limited to a small cottage or run to a sizable estate. How much he has left for other resources is not affected by his preferences about housing, and this market insensitivity has consequences not only for his own decision but for those of others as well. Football fans pay a different price for their tickets, for example, and thus compete with others for other goods on different terms than they would if each person's resources were more sensitive to the precise dimensions of his own preferences. The failure of flexibility is a general defeat for the program of equality of resources. Equality of resources prefers more abstract to less abstract auctions, not because costs of particular resources will be either higher or lower in more abstract auctions, nor because welfare will be overall greater and more equal, but rather because the general aim of that conception of equality, which is to make distribution as sensitive as possible to the choices different people make in designing their own plans and projects, is better achieved by the flexibility abstraction provides. That is the case for the principle of abstraction. The principle recognizes that the true opportunity cost of any transferable resource is the price others would pay for it in an auction whose resources were offered in as abstract a form as possible, that is, in the form that permits the greatest possible flexibility in fine-tuning bits to plans and preferences. It therefore insists that an auction must offer resources in that abstract form if the auction is to be recognized as identifying an equal distribution. Difficult questions will arise, of course, in applying this principle. Under some circumstances, it might be indeterminate which of two arrays of goods better satisfies the principle of abstraction, and in such cases, some further tiebreaker principle might be required. But in many cases, the advice of the principle will be straightforward enough. Remember the auctioneer who traded all the varied resources of the island for only plover's eggs. The trade was offensive to equality not because it disturbed the original array of goods, but because it violated the principle of abstraction in a fundamental way. It made the array much less sensitive, indeed as insensitive as possible, to the plans and preferences of the parties. If the auctioneer had found only plover's eggs on the island, and had alone been able costlessly to trade these of a mix of goods from other islands, which would have allowed bids in the auction to be more sensitive to the discrete tastes, plans, and ambitions of the bidders, the principle of abstraction would have required, not forbidden, him to do this. The principle also requires that natural resources be auctioned in as undifferentiated a form as is feasible, that iron ore be auctioned rather than steel, for example, and undeveloped land rather than fields of wheat. It requires, as our stadium example shows, the utmost feasible divisibility in the goods auctioned, so that people can bid on indefinitely small units of each resource, though not, of course, on units so small that no single unit can serve any purpose. It also requires recognizing legal rights in property that improve divisibility, like rights of way over and temporally bound interests in land rather than only freehold interests. So the principle of abstraction plays a central part in fixing the aspect of the auction baseline we are not principally considering now, the form in which goods are presented and lots distinguished. But it also plays a crucial part in fixing the baseline aspect that we are studying, the liberty constraint system that defines the place of liberty and equality of resources. Abstraction requires some legal limits on total freedom because resources cannot be fine-tuned to plans and projects unless people can count on controlling the resources they acquire. The principle of abstraction might therefore be thought to embrace what I call the principle of security. If so, the latter principle would be interpreted and applied in a special and interesting way. But legal constraints beyond those necessary for security obviously compromise abstraction. Clay is not auctioned in its most abstract form if the baseline system forbids satirical sculpture, because people anxious to express themselves in that way cannot tailor their resources to their plans as effectively with that constraint as they could without it. So the principle of abstraction insists that people should in principle be left free, under the baseline system, to use the resources they acquire, including the leisure they provide and project through their bidding program in whatever way they wish, compatibly with the principle of security. The principle of abstraction is crucial, therefore, to our main project. It establishes a general presumption of freedom of choice at the core of equality, and that takes a major step toward reconciling liberty and equality. The principle also has an important immediate consequence we should pause to consider. It seems to endorse the liberal thesis that legal prohibitions cannot be justified on the sole ground of that the conduct prohibited is offensive to some dominant religion or moral orthodoxy.